There are men who walk quietly through this world,
any combat
minds
pilot on
full of
board?
storms. They never speak. Of hearts carrying battles no one sees. On an ordinary flight in row 10, a tired single father rested with his little girl, unnoticed by the world around him. But when the captain's voice broke through the cabin, any combat pilots on board, the quiet man stood. And nothing on that plane would ever be the same. Before we begin, if stories of courage, kindness, and quiet heroes speak to your heart, we warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel. It helps us continue sharing healing, uplifting stories for those who still believe in goodness. Now, let us begin the journey. The soft hum of aircraft ventilation filled the cabin, like a distant lullaby, steady calm, almost comforting. For most passengers, this was just another flight, another stretch of hours between where they were and wherever they hoped life might take them. Work trips, family visits, vacations, meetings, life in motion. But for Daniel Miller and the tiny girl whose hand was wrapped trustingly around his sleeve, this flight was something different entirely. Not a trip away from home, rather a quiet pilgrimage toward a new one. Dan moved slowly through the aisle, careful not to wake the little head resting against his shoulder. Bella's loose chestnut hair brushed his jacket as she clung to him, half asleep, her stuffed bear tucked securely under her arm. At 6 years old, she carried innocence, the way some people carried armor effortlessly, without knowing its worth. He shifted his weight, mindful of other passengers' impatient glances. A businessman in a tailored suit tapped at his phone without looking up his knee, jutting into the aisle, as if the world owed him space. A young couple scrolled through vacation photos, laughing quietly. A tired grandmother in a denim jacket smiled at Bella with gentle curiosity, then returned to knitting a tiny baby sock. Row 10 seats C and D, Dan murmured to the flight attendant as he approached. She pointed gently. "Just there, sir. Need any help?" He shook his head. Voice soft. "We're okay. Thank you." It was not just his tone. There was something in his presence, a stillness that drew no attention, yet hinted at stories too heavy to be spoken casually. The long hair brushed past his collar, the worn olive jacket, the boots that had seen tougher terrain than airport carpet. To some, he looked tired, ordinary, perhaps even like someone life had worn down. To Bella, he was simply Daddy, and that was enough. She stirred as he lowered into his seat, her tiny voice warm and sleepy. "Daddy, are we in the sky yet?" He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Not yet. Little one. Soon." She yawned, drawing her stuffed bear closer. "I like the sky. Mommy said angels live way up there." Dan paused. A subtle ache crossed his eyes. Fleeting private swallowed almost as soon as it surfaced. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered. She did. Across the aisle, a woman in a crisp white captain's uniform walked the cabin with a clipboard. Captain Madison Brooks carried herself with precision and poise, chin-lifted steps, sure eyes attentive. The type of person who looked born in motion, born to lead. Her gaze swept row 10, flickering for an instant, as she slowed near Dan and Bella. Something about him tugged at her memory, perhaps the quiet posture, or the way he shielded Bella automatically when a bag shifted overhead. Or maybe it was the gentle tenderness that didn't quite fit the rugged edges he carried. She didn't stare long, just a second, a heartbeat, but long enough for Belle to notice. The little girl lifted her head, eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Hi," she chirped, wiggling her fingers in a tiny wave. Madison's expression softened into an unexpected smile. "Hello there. Are you going to fly us?" Bella asked, voice bright and unfiltered. Madison chuckled quietly. "Yes, I am, and I promise to do my best." Bella nodded solemnly, as if this were a sacred pact. "Do you fly really high, like where the angels are?" The question hit Madison like a sudden wind gust, An invisible pause brushed across her face. Her hand tightened slightly on her clipboard. "That's a very sweet thought," she replied softly. "Maybe not quite that high, but high enough to see the sunlight dance on the clouds." Bella seemed satisfied. Dan, however, caught the subtle flicker in the captain's eyes, a flash of something tender and wounded. He recognized it too well. Pain knows pain, even when disguised behind polished buttons and confident posture. "Buckle up, sweet girl," Madison added gently before moving on, her professional expression sliding back into place. Bella settled in, humming to her bear as she clicked her seatbelt. A row behind a voice muttered loud enough for others to hear. "Kids on airplanes. Unbelievable." Dan didn't turn. He simply placed a hand over Bella's small fingers and exhaled slowly. No anger. No reaction. Only quiet. "Daddy," Bella whispered. "Are we going to see the ocean in Florida?" Tweebly replied. "Warm sand, big sunshine, a fresh start. And Mommy will see us from the sky?" "Yes," he said again, though his voice threatened to betray the ache beneath it. "Mommy always sees us." The plane's chime sounded as passengers settled. Madison's voice flowed through the speakers, crisp yet warm. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 203 to Tampa. We expect a smooth flight with a bit of weather on the route, so please keep your seatbelts fastened while seated." Dan leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. Each breath felt like adjusting to a world he hadn't planned to return. To a world away from bases, call signs, radio static, and the roar of engines under strain. A world without the woman who had grounded him when the sky had been his battlefield. Now the world for him was this: Bella's tiny hand in his, steady and warm, and a mop and bucket waiting at the end of each day. A janitor, a father, quiet, unseen, but alive. And for now that was enough. Bella peeked up at him again. "Daddy." "Yes. Do angels like airplanes?" He smiled faintly. "I think they like watching people fly. It reminds them that we're always trying to reach something higher." She nodded in sleepy agreement and leaned against his arm. Outside the window, sunlight touched the edge of the horizon, painting the cabin in a gentle golden glow. Around them, passengers scrolled phones, adjusted suits, tucked blankets, or complained quietly about legroom. No one knew. No one guessed. To them, Dan was nobody. Just a tired dad. Just another traveler. Just another quiet life passing through the sky. But clouds hold secrets, and sometimes the quietest seats carry the souls with the loudest battles behind them. And soon, everyone on this plane would discover that truth, whether they were ready or not. The engines rumbled to life, a deep vibration running beneath the souls of every passenger as the plane taxied toward the runway. Conversations lowered, screens dimmed, and seatbelts clicked with finality. Dan smoothed the edge of Bella's blanket over her lap, tucking her safely into the small sanctuary their two seats formed. Bella pressed her cheek to the window, breath fogging the glass. "Daddy, look, the wings are waking up." Dan smiled softly. "They are, just like morning birds." She giggled, clutching her stuffed bear as the plane gained speed, wind rushing, louder engines roaring like distant thunder. Then, with a gentle lift, almost a sigh, the aircraft rose from Earth, carrying souls and stories upward into a boundless sky. Bella gasped, eyes widening. "We're flying, we're really flying." "Yes, sweetheart," Dan murmured, gaze softening. "We are." Behind them, a businessman loosened his tie and frowned, tapping irritably on his armrest. His Rolex glinted. His expression didn't. Brandon Cole had the air of a man accustomed to control of schedules, negotiations, and the behavior of people in his orbit, which perhaps explained why the innocent voice of a child unsettled him. Bella hummed lightly, making her bear look through the window. Brandon exhaled sharply. Unbelievable, he muttered. Parents need to keep their kids quiet. Dan turned slightly. Not confrontational, not defensive, just calm. She's excited. It's her first time seeing the world from above the clouds. Brandon scoffed. Trust me, sir. Some of us are trying to rest. I didn't pay for a playroom in the sky. Before Dan could respond, Bella blinked up at the businessman, her voice gentle. I'm sorry I made you upset. The man paused, surprised. Dan rested a hand softly on Bella's shoulder. You're not doing anything wrong. Bella nodded, though her little shoulders dipped slightly. Quiet apology lingering in her eyes. It would have been easy for him to harden in that moment, to let pride flare or ego defend. But Dan never raised his voice, never squared his shoulders in challenge. Instead, he simply offered a calm nod and turned back to Bella, whispering something that brought her smile back like sunrise after a cloud. Grace quietly wielded off and disarms louder tempers. The plane leveled off sunlight spilling through the windows. Captain Madison Brooks walked down the aisle again, checking latches, scanning faces. Her steps paused just a moment when she reached row 10. Bella sat up straighter. Hi again, flying lady. Several nearby passengers chuckled. Even Madison's composed facade softened. Hello again, she replied, kneeling slightly to Bella's eye level. Are you taking care of your dad? Bella nodded vigorously. Always. He gets tired sometimes because he cleans a big building. I help him fold socks. Madison's gaze shifted to Dan, surprise flickering. You're a custodian. Dan simply nodded, voice steady. Yeah. Night shifts mostly. Brandon leaned into the aisle just enough to be heard. And now he's flying right next to us. Fascinating. Madison shot him a warning look, professional, yet sharp enough to carve silence. Then her voice softened again as she turned to Bella. That's very kind of you. Folding socks is important work. Bella beamed proud. Dan offered a polite smile. Madison stood smoothing her uniform. We'll hit some turbulence ahead, so stay buckled, okay? Bella saluted dramatically. Aye, aye. Captain Madison grinned despite herself. That's my co-pilot spirit. She moved on. But her eyes drifted back once, just once, as though something about Dan tugged at a memory she couldn't quite place. A chord struck too lightly to identify yet, too clear to ignore. As the captain disappeared toward the cockpit, Brandon cleared his throat. Custodian, he murmured. No wonder. Dan heard it. He always heard more than he responded to. But he didn't flinch, just kept his eyes on Bella as she rocked her bear gently, still humming oblivious to judgment. Daddy, yes, Bella. Do janitors fly in dreams? He brushed a curl gently behind her ear. Everyone flies in dreams. She smiled again, pure unfazed, believing him entirely. To her, her father could do anything. Fix scraped knees, make pancakes in the shape of hearts, turn scary thunderstorms into songs about brave clouds. And yes, fly. The seatbelt light blinked on. A moment later, Madison's calm voice flowed through the speakers, now holding a note of caution. Ladies and gentlemen, we're entering an area of unstable air. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. A shudder rippled through the plane, gentle at first like a shrug. Bella gripped Dan's arm, eyes widening but trusting. It's okay, he whispered. Just the sky stretching. But turbulence has a way of shaking more than aircraft. It shakes people, their nerves, their illusions of control. Brandon tensed, visibly clutching his armrests, jaw tight. Suddenly, Bella began softly singing, voice innocent and sweet. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Dan looked at her gently. Maybe hum instead, sweet pea. People are a little nervous. She nodded and switched to a gentle hum. Her voice was a fragile thread, but it held calm, like a lantern in a dark room. Brandon stared straight ahead, knuckles white. Dan leaned slightly toward him, not intrusive, just present. "You okay?" Brandon blinked, startled by the kindness. "I don't like flying much." Dan nodded. "Most people don't." Silence. Then almost begrudgingly, Brandon whispered, "How is she so calm?" Dan glanced at Bella. A soft memory flickered in his eyes. Because she believes she's safe. Bella looked up, then catching her father's gaze, trust so pure, it felt like a blessing and a burden all at once. "Daddy keeps me safe," she said simply. "Always." Brandon swallowed hard. Something in that truth, delivered with such certainty, pulled at places within him he didn't admit existed. The plane jolted again, sharper this time. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Coffee sloshed. A suitcase rattled overhead. But Dan stayed still, calm, grounded, steady, as if turbulence belonged to another world. His hand rested lightly over Bella's, just a little bump peanut. The skies saying hello. She giggled softly, tension dissolving. Around them, some passengers stared, not at the turbulence, but at Dan. The quiet strength of a man who looked like he had already faced storms, far fiercer than this. Quiet doesn't always mean small. Sometimes it means surviving enough noise to choose silence. Outside, clouds thickened, turning the view into a soft gray curtain. The plane trembled again, but held. It always held for now. Bella leaned against Dan's arm, whispering tenderly to her bear, "Don't worry. Daddy knows how to fly through bumpy places." Dan looked out the window, expression unreadable. Once those words had been literal. Now they were simply true. And though no one else knew yet, the sky had begun to remember him. The sky darkened gradually, like a curtain being drawn over a quiet stage. What had begun as a peaceful ascent into soft morning blue now shifted into a world of shifting gray and uneasy murmurs. Overhead, bins rattled faintly. A coffee cup trembled in its holder, sending ripples across the surface like nervous heartbeats. Dan glanced sideways at Bella. She was tracing shapes on the window with her finger. Little stars, little hearts, her hum soft and true. Too young to sense danger the way adults do. Too trusting to imagine the sky as anything but a playground for angels. A tremor passed through the fuselage, small but sharper than before. Conversations hushed. Several passengers stiffened. Brandon Cole closed his eyes for a moment, jaw set, trying to breathe through a fear he hadn't expected to feel so publicly. The chime sounded again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated." "With your seatbelts fastened," came the co-pilot's voice, this time tighter, a thread of strain beneath forced calm. "We're encountering a weather pocket sooner than anticipated." Bella pressed her forehead gently to Dan's arm. Daddy the Cloud sounded a little grumpy. He brushed her hair with patient fingers. "Clouds get moody too," he replied softly. "Just like us. They'll calm down." Another jolt, a sudden dip this time, enough to make stomachs float. Gasps rippled across the cabin. A toddler cried somewhere near row 6. A woman whispered a prayer. Captain Madison emerged briefly from the cockpit, walking the aisle with intentional calm. Her expression remained steady, but Dan noticed her hand brush the seatbacks for balance. A pilot's instinct measuring the plane through fingertips and steel. She stopped at row 10 again, eyes flicking to Bella first, then Dan. "You two doing all right?" she asked, voice low. Bella nodded. Daddy said the sky is stretching. Madison's lips twitched in a small, appreciative smile. He's not wrong. Dan met her gaze. There was professional firmness there, but beneath it a glimmer, recognition, intuition, or something deeper, a feeling that this quiet man knew the language of storms. Another rumble. The overhead lights flickered just once. Madison exhaled slowly. "We'll be through it soon," she said. though her tone held the faint gravity of someone talking, not just to passengers, but to herself. She moved forward again. Crew members strapped in. The plane dipped harder this time. Trays rattled. A backpack shifted and bumped the aisle. Bella squeezed her stuffed bear tight. Dan lowered his arm over her, protectively quiet, instinctive, immovable. Not fear. Presence. The kind of stillness forged only in places where stillness is survival. Brandon watched him, confusion etched on his face. Confusion, and something like reluctant respect. "You're calm," he murmured. How are you calm?" Dan didn't answer right away. He kept his gaze forward as if listening to something beyond the hum and rattle, something only he could hear. Finally he spoke, voice low. "Panic makes the world smaller. You can't fly when the world gets small." Brandon blinked. Fly Dan didn't elaborate. A sudden violent jolt snapped seatbelts and voices. Luggage thudded. Somewhere behind them a cup hit the floor and rolled. The lights dimmed just a fraction. A child sobbed. A businessman cursed under his breath. The grandmother with knitting needles crossed herself quietly and whispered a verse. Bella's lip trembled. "Daddy, I'm here, Peanut." His tone was steady enough to steady her. "Look at me, okay?" She nodded, eyes wide but trusting. He cupped her cheek gently with his thumb. "You know what turbulence is?" he asked. She shook her head. "It's just the sky reminding us she's powerful, and that we're guests. We respect her, we breathe, and we keep going." Bella didn't fully understand, but she believed him completely. That was enough. The plane lurched again, this one sharper. A brief drop like the earth disappeared beneath them. Brandon's hand shot to the armrest. His voice cracked. "Oh God, please." And there, in the crack of fear, Dan's voice entered quiet grounding. Just a bump in the wind. We're still flying. A truth spoken simply. No theatrics, no bravado, just certainty. Yet behind his steady eyes, something flickered memory. A memory of desert heat shimmering on the horizon. The metallic scent of jet fuel. The rattle of a cockpit under gunfire. A voice in his headset yelling coordinates. And a smaller voice at home whispering goodnight before deployment. He blinked once, forcing the ghosts back into their corner. Past storms stay in the past. He had chosen that. He had promised that. A flight attendant passed by, kneeling briefly beside a frightened child 2 rows ahead. "We're okay, sweetheart," she murmured. "Just a little air pocket." The child nodded through tears. And then, soft, hopeful Bella lifted her bear and whispered, "It's okay, Bear. Daddy knows skies." Madison's voice crackled through speakers again. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We have a patch of rough air ahead, but our team is monitoring everything. Please stay seated." Her voice was steady, but Dan heard it, the thin strain hidden beneath practiced calm, the audible heartbeat of responsibility. Another jolt, swift, unexpected. The aisle lights blinked. Oxygen masks did not drop, but the cabin held its breath. Fear is contagious. So is courage. Dan leaned close to Bella. "Can you do something important for Daddy?" She blinked. "What is it?" "Hold my hand. Squeeze when you feel scared. I'll squeeze back. That way we carry the bumpy parts together." She nodded quickly and wrapped her tiny fingers around his. Like flying buddies. Exactly like that. She squeezed. He squeezed back. Steady, strong. Outside the windows, clouds thickened, billowing shapes in bruised grays, and whites, churning like ocean surf turned upside down. A voice somewhere whispered, "I hate flying." Another murmured, "Please, Lord." Brandon stared ahead, eyes unfocused. This wasn't supposed to happen today. Dan took a slow, measured breath. Life rarely checks our schedules. The turbulence eased slightly. Not calm, but less chaotic. Enough for shoulders to lower, for breaths to come easier. Bella leaned into Dan, eyes fluttering. Daddy, if the sky is big, does that mean angels can play hide-and-seek forever? He brushed her hair softly, voice gentle. Maybe that's why we can't see them, but we can feel them near us. She smiled in half-sleep. The stuffed bear's ear brushed her cheek, and above them, the storm waited. Ahead, something greater than turbulence brewed a moment that would change everything. But for now, there was only a quiet man in row 10, and a little girl holding his hand, and a plane, learning that some hearts stay steady in the sky, not because they've never fallen, but because they've already learned how to rise. The cabin steadied, the lights brightened, a collective breath released. Calm for now, before fate called again. The storm outside deepened, gathering in thick folds of cloud that pressed against the windows like mountains of gray wool. The sky rumbled softly, nature's quiet warning that control, when challenged by fate, was always borrowed, never owned. Inside the cabin was a study in tension. Passengers sat rigid, eyes fixed on invisible points ahead, or closed tight in prayer. The hum of the engine seemed louder than before, as if straining under the weight of weather and worry. Overhead lights glowed steadier now, but fear clung to the air, quiet, heavy human. Bella curled into Dan's side, small fingers still wrapped around his hand. She whispered to her bear, "It's okay. Don't be scared. Daddy's here." Dan tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You're doing great," he murmured. "Braver than the storm." She nodded, sleepy but comforted. To her, danger was softened by her father's presence. To her, safety had a heartbeat. It was the steady rhythm beneath his quiet calm. Then it happened. A sharp chime cut through the cabin. Not the usual tone of announcements, but something sharper, urgent. Heads lifted. A ripple moved through the seats. Dan's gaze sharpened instinct, rising like an old reflex. The cockpit door burst open. A young flight officer appeared, breath tight, face pale. His voice trembled despite training. Is there a doctor on board, or he swallowed, eyes wide? Anyone with medical experience? The captain! He collapsed. Gasps erupted. A woman in seat 5 covered her mouth. Brandon stiffened, color draining from his face. Someone whispered, "Oh, Lord." The cabin attendant rushed forward to assist, but the announcement wasn't done. The officer's voice cracked again. Louder now. Raw panic leaking through professional veneer. "We need medical help immediately." A man in a gray sweater unbuckled quickly. "I'm a nurse," he called, rushing forward. Others made space. Anxious hands lifting, guiding him toward the front. Dan watched. His breath remained, even eyes locked, not on the panic, but on the door left ajar, a brief glimpse into the cockpit's dim glow. A rhythm of alarms chimed faintly from within. Familiar. Terrifying. Ancient in his bones. He closed his eyes for half a second, just enough for memory to stir like dust in a sunbeam. A base runway at dawn, the hum of engines waking from sleep. A voice calling him, "Dust hog," hand steady on a throttle. Responsibility heavy as the horizon. Daddy, Bella whispered, sensing the shift in him. "Is someone hurt?" He nodded gently. "They're getting help." The storm nudged the plane again, a firm shove from nature, and a few passengers yelped softly. Overhead, the speaker crackled. The co-pilot's voice came through thin, strained, afraid. Folks, please remain calm. We're working through a situation up front." A pause, then a sentence that cracked the world open. "If there are any experienced pilots on board, military or commercial, please make yourself known to the crew immediately." Silence. Ice cold, complete absolute. A moment in time where hearts stopped, not because the engines faltered, but because fate had spoken aloud. in the voice of a frightened young aviator. Bella blinked at Dan. "Daddy, they need someone to fly." Her voice wasn't panicked, it was a child's simple understanding, pure and clean. She believed solutions existed because her world had been saved before by the gentleness of one man's hands. Her small fingers squeezed his. "Daddy, they need help." Dan inhaled slowly, breath-filling lungs trained in another life. His heartbeat did not race. It settled steady deep, as if the storm outside bowed to the storm within. He looked around. No one moved. Passengers stared wide-eyed at each other, waiting, hoping anyone would stand. Brandon glanced up and down the aisle, face pale, voice barely a whisper. "There has to be someone." Right. The grandmother clutched her knitting, whispering a prayer for a miracle. A young mother held her toddler tight, rocking gently, tears forming at the edges of her eyes. No one rose. No one except the little girl in seat 10C, who gently tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy," he looked down at her. Those eyes, pure trust, pure belief, were the same eyes his wife once had when she looked at him in uniform, proud and terrified all at once. The same eyes he saw in the mirror on the day he hung up his wings. "I don't want to be scared," Bella whispered. "You don't have to be," he replied. He squeezed her hand. Then he unbuckled his seatbelt, quietly, steadily, without announcement or ceremony. A few passengers stared. One murmured, "Sir, what are you doing?" Dan stood tall, not tall in height, but tall in presence. Bella looked up at him, admiration sparkling like sunlight on glass. He leaned down, brushed her forehead gently, and whispered, "Daddy promised to keep you safe. That means everyone here stays safe, too." She nodded, tears resting like pearls on her lashes. "Be careful, Daddy." His voice caught just slightly, almost imperceptible. "Always." Then he turned, walked into the aisle. Steps calm, back straight, shoulders level, not rushing, not seeking attention, simply answering a call that the sky itself had seemed to send. A few passengers gasped softly. Brandon stared, bewildered. The flight officer saw Dan approaching, hope flickering in his frightened eyes. "Sir, are you a pilot?" Dan's answer was quiet. "I was. No chest thumping. No claim. Just truth. I need to help." The young officer hesitated only a second, before nodding vigorously and stepping aside. "This way." Dan glanced back only once. Bella sat cupped in a halo of window light, hands pressed to her stuffed bear courage, trembling in her small shoulders. He gave her a tiny nod. "I'm here. I always come back." Then he disappeared into the cockpit. The door closed behind him. And in row 10, a little girl whispered to her, "Bear, Daddy's gonna help the sky." A woman across the aisle, eyes wet, whispered back without fully meaning to speak, "No, sweetheart. He's going to save us." Outside, thunder rolled. Inside, fate began to shift. The quiet man had stood, and the sky remembered his name. The cockpit door sealed shut behind Dan with a quiet, heavy click, but inside the cabin, time seemed to remain suspended on the hinge of that moment. For a breath, 2, 3, no one spoke. No one exhaled. Every soul sat perched on the edge of disbelief, staring at the space where he had stood, as if reality might rewind and return him to his seat with his little girl. Brandon Cole's voice, usually coated with polished confidence, was raw and thin when it finally broke the silence. "Him. That guy you're telling me a janitor is going to fly this plane." No one answered, perhaps because no one had the answer he wanted, or perhaps because deep down they sensed truth before logic caught up. Fear rarely leaves room for imagination. But hope sometimes sneaks in through cracks fear never sees. In seat 10C, Bella held her bear against her chest and stared at the cockpit door with solemn determination. Tears made tiny prisms in her eyes, but did not fall. Her lips moved silently, words of encouragement or prayer, the line between them thin as a whisper. Brandon raked a trembling hand through his hair. He's going to get us all killed. A cane tapped, a slow, steady sound, firm as a heartbeat. An elderly man stood frail in body but not in spirit. His hair was silver, his uniform jacket old but dignified, worn with the quiet pride of someone who once bore the weight of command. Major David Hale Rhett did not tremble when he rose. His voice, when it came, carried the authority of memory and sacrifice. "You watch your tone, son." Brandon blinked. "Excuse me." That man walked into that cockpit with the calm of someone who's been there before. The veteran said, one hand gripping his cane, the other resting over a heart that still remembered battle rhythms. "There's a difference between fear and foolishness. Don't confuse your panic with his purpose." Before Brandon could respond, another jolt rattled the cabin. The lights flickered. A baby cried. Someone gasped aloud. A young woman clutched her boyfriend's hand, as if anchoring herself to the world. Bella squeezed her bear tight. "Daddy knows skies," she whispered fiercely, as if daring the storm to disagree. Brandon swallowed hard, chest rising with uneven breaths. "You're all insane. He cleans floors for a living. He's not a pilot." Major Hale fixed him with a gaze steady as an oak rooted against wind. Some men choose quiet work, not because they can't do more, but because they already have. The cabin attendant approached carefully. "Sir, we need you to stay seated." Hale nodded, lowering back into his seat, but his words lingered like the aftershock of distant artillery. The mother of the toddler across the aisle glanced at Bella. "Sweetheart is your daddy. Really a pilot." Bella hugged her bear tighter. Daddy flew big ones, loud ones. She mimicked engines with her tiny voice buzzing her lips. "Brum," Uncle Joe said Daddy was the best hog pilot ever. "Hog pilot," someone murmured. "What is that?" A-10 Major Hale said quietly. "Warthog. Close air support. Low-altitude gun runs. They don't make pilots braver than that." A hush swept like wind through wheat. Brandon's jaw worked, searching for purchase in a world that suddenly seemed unfamiliar. If he was some kind of legendary pilot, why is he mopping floors? No one answered him. Not yet, because the story wasn't his to explain. Inside the cockpit, Dan slid into the seat muscles, finding positions they hadn't held in years. Instruments glowed. Alarms blinked. The young first officer looked at him like breath held between life and loss. "Captain Brooks is unconscious," he stammered. "I don't know what happened. Her pulse is weak." The defib Dan didn't flinch. His voice was quiet steel. "Focus. I need weather input, current altitude, remaining fuel, and system checks." The officer blinked. "Sir, who are you?" Dan didn't look up, fingers already moving with muscle memory older than grief. "A dad," he murmured, "who used to fly." A pause. "Then A-10 74th Fighter Squadron. Call sign Dust Hog." Recognition detonated in the young officer's eyes like dawn breaking. Stories whispered across flight schools. Footage studied by cadets. The ghost of a pilot known not by medals, but by the soldiers who swore they lived because he refused to leave them behind. "But you," the officer whispered, voice shaking. "You disappeared." Dan's jaw tightened, not in arrogance, but in grief. Some missions don't end just because you come home. The plane jolted again, the storm outside clawing at metal wings. Dan steadied his breath. "We'll talk later. Right now, we fly." Back in the cabin, Brandon leaned forward, whispering to no one in particular. People don't just walk away from being legends. Major Hale turned to him, eyes shadowed with memory. Sometimes they walk because the world takes too much from them. Sometimes the quietest men once screamed loudest in the sky. Bella's voice floated soft but clear. Daddy had to take care of me. Mommy went to heaven. The row fell silent. Even Brandon froze, remorse flickering behind his fear. A tear slipped down Bella's cheek, but she didn't wipe it. Daddy says flying hurts when someone you love isn't waiting when you land. There it was. Truth unvarnished. Delivered not through medals or salutes, but through a child's simple ache. The turbulence eased for a moment, as if even the sky bowed its head. Major Hale reached out, gently touching Bella's hand with his weathered fingers. Your daddy didn't disappear, sweetheart. Heroes don't vanish. They just rest where the world can't see them. Bella sniffed tiny chin, trembling with pride, not sadness. Daddy always comes back. Brandon stared at the cockpit door, guilt settling in his features like dust after impact. I didn't know. Most people never do, the grandmother whispered. Knitting paused in her lap. The intercom clicked. Silence. Then not the voice of panic from before, but a tone calm enough to breathe again. Ladies and gentlemen, the young officer said steadier. Now we have an experienced pilot assisting us. Please remain calm. He didn't say the man's name, didn't reveal who sat behind that door. But calm rippled through the cabin like dawn through fog. A light hand rested on Bella's shoulder. The mother across the aisle smiled softly. Your daddy's very brave. Bella nodded, wiping her cheek. He says bravery is quiet. And row 10 believed her, because the sky had asked any combat pilots on board, and a janitor had stood. Quietly. Steadily. As only someone who once flew through fire could. Inside the cockpit, the storm's roar pressed against steel and glass like a living thing. Rain hammered the windshield in wild streaks, the sky outside twisting with wounded fury. Warning lights blinked in sharp red pulses, and the aircraft shook in uneasy shudders as though uncertain of its own strength. Dan settled into the left seat, not with swagger, not with nostalgia, but with a quiet acceptance, like someone picking up a violin they once played to survive a winter. His fingers brushed the yoke. The leather felt different, modern civilian, but the weight never changed. The responsibility, the sky's unspoken pact, earn every second you stay alive. The young first officer glanced nervously at him. His hands trembled as he worked through systems. We lost autopilot momentarily. It's back, but unstable. Captain Brooks, she collapsed during descent prep. I tried to call for guidance, and Dan lifted one hand, not to silence him, but to steady him. Breathe, son. What's your name, Lieutenant? First Officer Riley. Evan Riley. He swallowed, ashamed at the stammer. You military, Dan asked, eyes scanning instruments. ROTC. Evan whispered. Didn't finish flight track. Went commercial. Dan nodded. Then you know one thing already. What's that, sir? Fear means you still care what happens next. That's good. We'll use that. The younger man blinked, breath catching as if he'd been handed a rope in a flood. A soft groan came from the cabin doorway. A flight attendant guided Captain Madison Brooks inside, pale and unsteady, but conscious now barely. She leaned against the panel, hand-braced eyes struggling to focus. Captain Evan breathed relief, and fear tangled. Madison's gaze moved blurry at first, then sharpening like a camera lens snapping into perfect focus. And when her eyes landed on Dan, actually saw him. It happened. Recognition. Not the polite sort. Not memory from a safety briefing or pilot's roster. No. This was sharp, stunned, soul-deep recognition. The kind that freezes a heartbeat, mid-beat. Dan, Her voice cracked on his name, disbelieving. Daniel Miller. He didn't answer immediately, just held her gaze with quiet steadiness, the storm outside reflected in his pupils. Madison's breath hitched. Dust hog. The cockpit fell into a suspended hush. Evan's head jerked between them. He mouthed the call sign silently like a student watching a myth step off a textbook page and sit down beside him. Dan finally nodded once small, humble. It's been a while. Years, Madison whispered. They said you vanished. No retirement announcement. No memorial. You just disappeared from the roster. Dan kept his voice low, steady, unwavering. I didn't vanish. I landed. And stayed. Landed. Madison swallowed hard. I flew after you. Training flights. They spoke your name like a legend. You saved her. Voice faltered emotion pressing at edges. You saved crews when no one else would go low. We fly who we love, Dan said simply. We protect who we can. That's all. A shudder passed through the aircraft. Evan jolted eyes darting back to the instruments. We're losing altitude margin. Storm cells closing on both sides. We need to divert, but the nearest runway is too far if we fight the storm, Dan finished. We ride with it, not against it. Madison pressed a hand to her temple, fighting dizziness. You can't just... I'm not here to take your command, Dan said, voice gentle but grounded in steel. You tell me what you need. I fly your aircraft, your crew, your passengers. That respect humble firm earned, not demanded, brought clarity back to her eyes. The fog lifted. She straightened, gripping the panel but standing proud. Okay, she breathed. Okay. Work with me. Their eyes held for a brief moment. Not romance. Not then. But mutual recognition. Not of past connection, but of shared sky-shared understanding. Some people meet on ground. Others first meet in freefall. Madison slid into the right seat, breath steadier. Checklist. Storm penetration settings. We keep speed steady. No abrupt inputs. Dan nodded, already adjusting trim. Roger that. Evan exhaled, shoulders dropping slightly. Thank God you're here. Dan didn't look at him. Thank the sky. She hasn't kicked us out yet. Thunder cracked beyond the glass like heaven's drum. Lightning flashed, jagged white raw. But Dan didn't flinch. His hands held steady muscles, remembering how to make steel birds dance through danger. Madison watched him work, smooth, grounded, instinctive. A professional? Yes. A warrior once. But the thing that struck her deepest wasn't skill. It was restraint. A man who had fought the sky once and learned to treat it with reverence now. Why didn't you return? She whispered, barely audible under alarms. The Air Force needed pilots like you. Dan's jaw tensed faintly. My daughter needed a father more. It was simple. It was the truth. It was everything. Silence answered him, but it wasn't emptiness. It was respect. Madison turned back to her instruments with new steadiness. Outside, the clouds parted for a heartbeat, revealing the glow of sun piercing the storm, like hope breaking through grief. Bella's face flickered through Dan's mind, those wide, trusting eyes, believing skies could never take him from her again. He tightened his grip, not out of fear, but promise. I'll get us through, he murmured. Madison nodded. We will. 2 pilots, 1 cockpit, 1 storm, and between them a quiet thread forming invisible but real. Not romance yet, but recognition. Not destiny, but the beginning of something earned. Brace, Dan said softly. Updraft incoming. They hit it air, lifting the aircraft suddenly, violently. Evan yelped, gripping the console. Madison steadied her breathing. Dan leaned into the controls, coaxing, guiding, not fighting. Easy, easy, he murmured, like calming a spooked horse. Ride the breath, not the wind. And the plane responded not perfectly, not without trembling, but guided by hands that remembered how to talk to storms. The nose steadied. The altitude held. Madison let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Dust hog. You're still Dan, he corrected gently. Just Dan now. Her eyes softened. Pilots don't stop being pilots. They just fly different skies. He almost smiled. Almost. The storm wasn't done yet, and neither was fate. The aircraft pressed deeper into the storm, swallowed by clouds so thick the world beyond the glass ceased to exist. No horizon, no sky, just swirling gray and the hum of engines pushing against nature's will. The cabin lights glowed low and warm, but fear had turned the air electric. Every passenger felt it, an invisible hand gripping the plane, and somewhere inside each heart the question, can we survive this? In the cockpit, Dan and Madison worked in near-synchronized silence, toggling systems, checking weather radials, trimming pitch. Lightning flashed ahead, white fire across the windshield, followed by a deep rumble that felt less like sound and more like the sky warning its intruders to tread humbly. Evan Riley's hands shook subtly as he monitored telemetry. His breath was audible in the small space, wind shear increasing. Vertical gusts. Severe. We stay smooth, Madison said, her voice a tight anchor. No reactive yoke inputs. Let the air settle before we. A violent jerk cut her off. The plane dropped hard. Gasps and screams burst from the cabin. Luggage thudded overhead. A coffee cup flew splattering like dark rain across the galley wall. Evan flinched. Madison grabbed the armrest. Dan's jaw hardened, but his hands did not waver. Hold attitude, he murmured. Trust the wings. Madison looked over, saw the stillness in him, and drew steadiness from it, like warmth from a flame. Yet doubt flickered in her eyes, not about his skill, but about the fight itself. Their lives, every soul on board, hung in the balance. The weight was crushing, even for those trained to carry it. Talk to me, Dan said quietly. What's in your head? Madison swallowed. This storm wasn't forecast this severe. Instruments are fluctuating. And, her voice lowered. If we lose another system, we won't, Dan said calmly. Fear anticipates failure. Focus anticipates survival. Her gaze lingered on him, searching his face. Does anything shake you? He didn't answer immediately. Outside wind howled against aluminum like a wolf against a locked door. Finally he spoke. Everything shakes me. The trick is learning to shake without falling. Madison breathed in deeply. Something inside her steadied. Another jolt, less violent this time, rattled them. Evan exhaled shakily. Sir, you talk like a philosopher, not a pilot. Dan adjusted the rudder trim a fraction. After enough flights, they become the same thing. In the cabin, panels vibrated. A baby cried. Someone whispered Hail Marys into trembling palms. Flight attendants strapped in and traded quick, tight nods. Professional faces stretched thin over human fear. Brandon Cole gripped both armrests, face pale sweat gathering at his temple. Why aren't we climbing out of it? He muttered, voice breaking. Why aren't we? Why aren't they doing something? The elderly veteran Major Hale turned his head slowly. They are doing something. They're flying through hell so we don't fall out of the sky. How do you know? Brandon choked. Hale's eyes didn't waver. Because I've seen that look in a man's eyes before. The kind of calm that only comes from having already survived his worst day. A woman across the aisle covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. God bless whoever's up there. Bella sat small but steady, clutching her bear, rocking gently, like she was soothing it rather than herself. Her voice was a soft hum broken at times by small quivers, but returning like hope, refusing to quiet. Finally, she whispered, "Daddy." The grandmother beside her offered a fragile smile. "He can hear you in here and in there, sweetheart." Bella nodded, as if she understood the secret language of love across distance. Her voice lifted just a little. "Daddy always comes back." And some hearts steadied hearing that, because sometimes courage trickles from the smallest voices. Back in the cockpit, rain hammered harder. The storm seemed to pulse alive and unpredictable. Dan's left hand flexed once not fear, but memory of an old injury, nerves tingling like ghosts of metal and shrapnel. Madison noticed. "Your arm." "Temporary weakness," he said quietly. "Not failure." She nodded, but her chest tightened. She had trained under instructors who spoke his name in reverent tones. Yet here he sat, worn jacket, tired eyes, a single dad who scrubbed floors at night to raise a child alone. "Dan," she murmured, "you shouldn't be invisible." He didn't look at her. "Some men don't need the world to see them, Madison. They just need one person to." Her breath caught. She didn't ask who. Some truths were sacred. Then her voice dropped gentle and raw. "I'm glad you're here." He glanced at her, then just a flick, a soft look that held years of unspoken ache and resolve. "I promised someone I wouldn't let others fall. Your daughter and her mother." The cockpit fell quiet, heavy reverent. Outside, a sudden clearing appeared, a pocket of calm surrounded by chaos. Dan eased the plane into it like sliding a key quietly into a lock. "Rest the wings," he whispered. "Let them breathe." The aircraft steadied, instrument jitter calmed. Evan sagged in relief. Madison exhaled, astonished. "You make it look like surviving," he said. "Not flying." She shook her head in awe. "You could be commanding a squadron, training pilots, changing lives." "I am changing one," he replied. "The most important one." She blinked hard. Something inside her shifted, respect becoming tenderness, admiration becoming ache. Storms are not only outside metal walls. Sometimes they churn in hearts too. In row 10, Bella stopped humming. Her breathing slowed. Her head rested against the window, and she whispered to her bear. "He's winning." She knew. Somehow, she always knew. Passengers looked at her with fragile hope. Belief spreads like light even in storms. Brandon ran a hand over his face, voice low and trembling. I judged him. Hale nodded. Better to realize that at 30,000 feet than never at all. Brandon swallowed. "How do you apologize to a man saving your life?" The old soldier looked forward toward the sealed cockpit door. "You don't speak it first. You live it." In the cockpit, Madison's hand brushed Dan's lightly as she reached for a throttle switch. A small touch. But his fingers froze, not from discomfort, but from remembering what connection felt like. Two souls steadied a plane. Two pilots steadied each other. Outside, thunder cracked, but softer, as if the sky too sensed them reclaiming control. Madison whispered, barely audible, "When this is over, tell me how you learned to carry storms like that." Dan's eyes stayed forward, hands steady on the yoke. "When this is over," he said quietly, "I'll tell you how to survive them." Outside, the clouds churned like a restless sea. Lightning flashed in jagged streaks, illuminating a sky torn between fury and surrender. Wind sheared across the wings with hungry teeth, and the aircraft trembled, not failing, but fighting. Inside the cockpit, alarms pulsed, quietly persistent reminders that fate had not yet decided which way to turn. Altitude stable at 22,000. Evan reported, voice steadier now, but still threaded with awe. Storm cell ahead intensifying. Madison's eyes scanned radar. "We can't climb. We can't outrun it." Dan nodded, his grip firm, measured. "So we go through." Evan swallowed. "Sir." With respect, manual flight through a storm cell, is what happens when autopilot can't think fast enough, Dan finished gently. And storms don't wait for courage. The younger pilot fell silent, not in fear this time, but in respect. Madison shifted her oxygen mask aside slightly, voice low. Nearest runway is Tampa, secondary emergency strip at MacDill, but they'll need a declaration and tower prep. Dan didn't hesitate. We're landing. Manual approach. Evan blinked. Manual. In this, Dan's voice held no bravado, just truth shaped by memory. Steel was meant to fly. Humans were meant to decide. Madison met his eyes, their shared understanding flickering between them like a spark refusing to die. Let's bring them home. But even heroes bleed, and even the sky demands payment for safe passage. A sudden clunk shuddered through the aircraft, deep gutting mechanical. Warning lights flared amber. Evan's head snapped up. Engine 2 torque fluctuation. The right engine wailed a metallic groan that felt like a heart straining under too much weight. The aircraft dipped and rocked hard. In the cabin, screams erupted again. Trays rattled. A laptop crashed to the floor. A water bottle rolled the length of the aisle, hitting a seat leg and spinning like a coin debating its fall. Bella jerked awake, small body tense. "Daddy," she whispered, eyes wide with fear. She tried so hard to swallow. A flight attendant knelt by her, instantly voice soft, despite rattling nerves. "He's right up front, sweetie. He's helping keep us safe." Bella clutched her bear tightly. He always does. Major Hale leaned forward, voice quiet but certain. "Your father's flown worse skies, little one. He'll get us through." Brandon bowed his head into his hands. "God, please." Even disbelief prays when steel shakes in storm hands. Back in the cockpit, Dan steadied the throttle, compensating manually. "Engine's not lost. It's stressed. We treat it like a wounded soldier, support it. Don't force it." Madison breathed, deep voice, taut but trusting. "Okay, flap prep, fuel balance, approach path." They worked like two halves of the same decision, different rhythms, same heartbeat. Sweat beaded on Madison's temple. Every instinct warred with training, then surrendered to it again. "Why didn't you come back?" she whispered between checklist items, not prying but aching to understand. "A pilot like you." Dan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he trimmed pitch eyes, scanning every reading like scripture. When he spoke, his voice carried weight, not sorrow. When she died, he said there was no sky left worth flying. Madison's breath caught not pity, but recognition. "Your wife." "My world," he acknowledged softly. "And after her, there was only my daughter. Flying cost me one family. I refused to let it risk the other. There was nothing to say to that." She didn't try. Instead, she placed a quiet hand near his on the throttle, not touching, just near a silent vow of presence. "We'll land together," she said. Dan nodded once. Together. In the cabin, oxygen masks dangled loosely above heads, not deployed, but swaying menacingly. A toddler whimpered. A teenage boy squeezed his mother's arm. Someone whispered psalms. Bella rose to her knees, little hands pressed together, not out of fear, but out of faith she hadn't yet learned to question. "Please," she whispered, eyes toward the front, "help Daddy fly again. Help skies be gentle." The simplicity of it softened spines hardened by terror. The woman beside her whispered, "Amen." Brandon turned, eyes wet. "Kid, your dad, he's really doing this." Bella nodded, chin trembling, but voice firm. "Daddy always comes back." Even Major Hale blinked rapidly. Memories of younger soldiers, steadier skies flashing behind old eyes. "He's fighting two battles," he murmured. "The one outside, and the one he's carried alone." Back in the cockpit, rain hammered harder, each drop a tiny bullet against the windshield. The runway approach flashed on screen, a thin line drawn across chaos. Madison tightened her harness. Visibility 0. Dan's voice lowered calm like a hymn. Then we land by feel. Evan stared. That's impossible. No, Dan said softly. That's flying. He guided the aircraft into descent, gentle at first, then deeper, cutting through layers of storm, until even the sky seemed to gasp around them. You're not afraid? Madison asked. Dan's lips moved, not quite a smile. I'm terrified, he said. I just don't let fear fly the plane. Her breath hitched. Something inside her, some guarded place, shifted open by a fraction. The storm roared. The runway lights flickered on radar ghosts and rain. Madison whispered, "Why trust me?" "Because you're still here," he replied. "And staying is harder than flying." Their eyes met. Not romance, not yet, but two spirits bruised and standing in the same wind. "Final descent," he announced. "Ready," she whispered. In the cabin, Bella squeezed her bear tight. Almost there, she whispered to him and to herself. Brandon pressed his palms together, not sure if he was praying or apologizing. Major Hale closed his eyes. "Bring us home, son." The plane dipped, shuddered, committed. Back in the cockpit, rain streaked the glass. Thunder rolled. The ground remained invisible. But Dan held the yoke like it was memory itself. Glide path steady, Madison breathed. Wings holding Dan answered. "Trust," she murmured. "Always," he replied. And through storm and trembling steel, through heartbreak and hope, through fear and fragile faith, the aircraft touched down. Not soft, not perfect, but alive. Tires screamed, metal groaned, bodies jerked in belts. And then silence, a breathless, holy silence. They had landed, and for a moment no one moved. No one spoke. The world felt paused, suspended on the thin edge between disaster and miracle. Dan exhaled slowly. Madison closed her eyes, a tear escaping relief, awe, gratitude. "You did it," she whispered. Dan shook his head, voice soft. "We did." Rain fell in silver sheets outside the aircraft, streaking the windows like tears shed by the sky itself. Emergency lights flashed along the runway as first responders raced forward. Sirens wailed in the distance, but inside the plane, there was only stunned silence, a silence too full to break. For one suspended breath, no one understood what they had survived. Then the realization sank in like dawn, rising behind heavy clouds. They were alive. Gasps turned to sobs. Prayers shifted into shaky laughter. Strangers clutched one another with trembling hands, and some just sat, frozen, caught between disbelief and gratitude. Bella was already unbuckling herself. She bounced to her feet, bear in hand, hope and joy overflowing like a child who had never doubted the world could be saved. "Daddy did it," she whispered, eyes shining. "He really did it." The grandmother next to her squeezed her little hand. "Your father." "Sweetheart, he didn't just fly, he carried us." Bella nodded firmly. "He always does." A flight attendant sniffed back tears and wiped her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until the crew confirms." Her voice wavered. She took a deep breath, steadied. "Until the captain confirms the aircraft is secure." But inside, everyone already knew the truth. The plane wasn't secure because of a system or protocol. It was secure because a quiet father in row 10 had stood when no one else could. In the cockpit, Dan eased his hands off the controls muscles, trembling not from fear, but from release. Flying had always been fighting, and trusting in equal measure. And faith was what brought metal down gently when Sky tried to take it. Madison inhaled deeply, pulling her oxygen mask off. Relief softened her face, making her look almost younger. She placed one hand over the instrument panel, an unspoken prayer of thanks. "You flew like the sky still knew your name," she whispered. Dan rested back against the seat, eyes closed for a moment. "Wings remember," he said quietly, "even when we try to forget." Her gaze stayed on him, studying not the legend she had once admired from afar, but the man worn at the edges, gentle where the world expected steel, carrying wounds without letting them speak louder than his purpose. "You never stopped being a pilot," she murmured. He opened his eyes, meeting hers. "I stopped being everything so I could be a dad." Madison swallowed emotion, tightening her throat. "And yet here you are, saving strangers like they were your family." He shook his head. "They are someone's family." Her breath caught. She knew then, not in admiration but in understanding. This wasn't a man who flew because he loved glory. He flew because he could not bear the thought of others falling. In the cabin, emergency crews approached from outside. Through raindrops, silhouettes moved with urgency, flashlights cutting through gray. Brandon Cole stood slowly, knees weak. He looked toward the cockpit door, shame and awe clashing inside him like thunder meeting earth. "I judged him," he murmured. "All that time, I judged him." Major Hale nodded with solemn pride. "Most heroes don't look like heroes until the world asks them to rise." Brandon's voice cracked. "How do you face a man after you've misjudged him like that?" "You face him the way you should have from the beginning," Hale replied. "With humility." Bella was already bouncing in place, small hands clenched around her bear. "I want Daddy." And then the cockpit door opened. Dan stepped out, not triumphant, not radiant, not a conquering warrior, but tired, humble present. His hair was damp with sweat, jaw tight from concentration, eyes soft with relief. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Bella launched from her seat, with the force of hope made small and fast. Daddy Dan knelt just in time, arms open, catching her as she collided with pure love. "You came back," she breathed, hugging him fiercely. He pressed his forehead to hers, voice breaking with something wider than pride. "Always." Passengers watched them, some wiping tears, others holding hands over their hearts. It was not just a reunion, it was proof. Heroes don't always wear uniforms when they save the world. Sometimes they wear exhaustion, humility, and the weight of a promise to a child. Madison stepped out behind Dan, steadying herself. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, her hair loose from stress, but her expression held warmth and gratitude. One by one, passengers began to applaud. Soft at first, then louder. A wave of emotion crested and broke across the cabin. Applause mingled with sobs and cheers, a symphony of thanks. A middle-aged man stood and saluted. A woman clasped her hands like prayer. Someone whispered, "Thank you," again and again, unable to stop. Brandon approached slowly, guilt etched into his face. "Sir," he began, voice unsteady. "I was wrong about you." Dan looked up at him gently, still holding Bella. "Fear makes us all say things we don't mean." Brandon shook his head. "No excuses." "I'm sorry." Dan extended a hand not to shake, but to rest briefly on Brandon's shoulder. "Tomorrow's another chance to be someone better." Brandon swallowed hard and nodded, tears breaking loose. Outside, camera phones were already up. The world outside the cabin began to take notice, lights focusing phones, recording, hands pointing. A viral moment being born. But Dan didn't see them, didn't care. His world was one small girl with tear-stained cheeks and the unbroken trust of a child who believed her father had saved the sky. Madison watched quietly, emotion glimmering in her eyes. Not the awe of a trainee recognizing a legend anymore, but the tenderness of a woman seeing a man who had once fallen from the clouds only to rise again where it mattered most. To his daughter. To strangers who would remember this day for the rest of their lives, to himself. Outside, rain continued to fall, but inside something brighter began to rise. Hope, quiet, steady, earned. The world greeted them not with chaos, but with awe. Beyond the jet bridge, lights flashed and radios crackled. Emergency personnel hurried forward, but not with panic. Their strides held purpose, not fear. They had expected casualties, catastrophe, tragedy carved across metal. Instead, they found a miracle wrapped in rain. Passengers filed off the aircraft, slowly hushed, reverent, some holding hands, others wiping their cheeks as if trying to brush away the strange blessing of still being here. Dan carried Bella in one arm, her tiny fingers curled in his shirt. She clung to him, not in fear, but in pride, her head resting on his shoulder like she belonged nowhere else. He would have carried her, even if his arms shook with exhaustion. Especially then. Madison walked beside them, pace measured, but presence commanding. Not from rank, but from dignity earned. Her hair was damp against her cheek. Her uniform wrinkled her eyes red from adrenaline and emotion. Yet she carried herself with a grace born from survival, not perfection. Reporters alerted by passenger live streams had already gathered. Security held them back, but microphones stretched outward like hungry hands. Questions flew like hail. "Sir, are you really the one who landed the plane? Is it true? You were a military pilot? What's your name? Are you a commercial captain? Why haven't we heard of you before? What happened in the cockpit?" "Sir, please one comment." Dan shifted Bella's weight, gently adjusting her against his chest. She yawned, curling into him with complete trust. He brushed her hair back with his thumb and looked forward, not answering a single question. He had flown into storms and walked through heartbreak. Noise bounced off him like rain off steel. Major Hale emerged behind him, leaning on his cane like a retired lion, surveying a world younger than his scars. A reporter shouted toward him, "Sir, you served right. Can you confirm the identity of the man who landed the plane?" Hale fixed her with a gentle but firm stare. "His identity isn't yours to claim, but his impact, we all just lived it." And that was enough to silence even the hungriest microphone. One by one, passengers stopped near Dan, not because cameras told them to, but because their hearts did. A mother placed her hand over her chest, eyes glassy. A businessman bowed his head in silent thanks. A college kid muttered, "Dude, you're unreal," in a voice reverent as prayer. Brandon approached last steps, slow humility stitching his posture together. "Dan," he said quietly, "I don't know how to say thank you without sounding small." Dan looked at him, eyes soft, but contained. "You don't need to say anything." But Brandon shook his head. "Yes, I do." He swallowed. "When I saw you sitting there, I judged you by the world's standards. Money, clothes, job, appearance." His voice cracked. "And I was wrong." Dan shifted Bella, who now blinked sleepily at Brandon. "Most of us forget who we are sometimes," Dan said softly. "Life reminds us when it matters." Brandon exhaled a breath that sounded like repentance. "If there's ever a day I can repay the good you gave us today." He paused. "I hope I recognize it in time." Dan offered a small nod, not acceptance as a gesture of power, but forgiveness as a gift freely given. Bella looked up at Brandon and whispered, "It's okay. Daddy says everyone's learning." Brandon laughed through his tears. "He's right." He stepped aside. Now only Madison remained. She watched Dan with a quiet that wasn't uncertain it was full. Full of emotions the storm had churned up and laid bare. Full of respect. Full of wonder. Full of questions she didn't need him to answer yet. "You could have told them," she murmured. "Told them your name." your rank, what you've done." Dan shook his head gently. "Today wasn't about who I used to be." She exhaled. "Most people spend their lives trying to prove themselves." Her voice softened. "You don't even try." He glanced down at Bella, his anchor his compass. "I already know who I am." Madison followed his gaze, her throat tightening. "She's lucky." Dan's voice lifted quiet but unshaking. "I'm the lucky one." Silence stretched between them, not awkward, not heavy. Peaceful. Respect holding space like open sky. Madison nodded slowly. "I'll be in touch. FAA will need statements, and I'd like to check on her." She gave Bella a soft smile. Bella waved sleepily. "You're a good sky lady." Madison laughed softly, blinking hard. "You be good for your dad." "She's the good one," Dan murmured. "I don't doubt it." Madison's voice warmed an ember-catching light. Then she stepped closer, close enough for sincerity, not spectacle. "Dan, the world may not know what you did today, but the sky does." Her voice trembled just slightly. "And so do I." He didn't flinch away, didn't romanticize it. Just let the words settle. "Thank you," he said, simple and true. She nodded once, meaning it more deeply than she had ever meant a salute. "Get her home safe." "As long as I breathe," he answered. And he meant every syllable. He walked toward the exit, Bella asleep in his arms, the world parting before him, not out of reverence, but out of gratitude. People made space not for a hero, but for a father who chose love over glory, purpose over praise, second chances over second chapters of war. He stepped into the gentle Florida rain, the kind that didn't threaten, but cleansed. Bella stirred. "Daddy, yes, Peanut, did we fly good?" Dan kissed her hair. "We flew exactly how we needed to." She nodded, satisfied, and drifted back to sleep. Behind them, cameras continued to roll, but for the first time in a long time, Dan didn't feel chased by memory. He felt led by hope. The sky had seen him, the world had glimpsed him, but the only audience that mattered was safely in his arms. He didn't rise again today because he missed the sky. He rose because a little girl needed to land, and because sometimes flying isn't about leaving the earth, it's about returning to it. The storm was a memory, now traded for sunlight filtering through palm leaves, and the hum of cicadas drifting across a quiet Florida neighborhood. A week had passed, not long in days, yet enough to soften the tremors in Dan's bones, enough for Bella's drawings of airplanes to change from swirling clouds and shaky lines to bright hearts and wings that looked like they could hold up the sky. Their small bungalow sat at the end of a sleepy street, its porch dressed in chipped white paint and potted flowers Bella insisted were for Mommy to see from heaven. Wind chimes whispered above soft and hopeful notes, carried by breeze instead of fear. Inside the kitchen table bore humble signs of evening macaroni bowls, apple slices, a coloring page half finished with exuberant strokes of purple crayon. Bella sat cross-legged on her chair, swinging her feet as she hummed to her bare chin, tipped up in a quiet. Peace only children and healed soldiers could wear. Dan washed a pot at the sink. Sleeves rolled up, the faint scent of soap and warm pasta filling the room. His movements were slow, not with fatigue, but with savoring. The kind a man has when he has seen days darker than night, and now refuses to rush through the gentle ones. Daddy Bella called voice bright as sunlight. "Yes, Peanut. Do angels eat macaroni too?" He smiled. "They might, but I think they prefer seeing you enjoy it." She beamed. "I ate extra, so Mommy's happy." Dan's hand paused in the dishwater breath, hitching not in pain but gratitude. "She is," he whispered. "She'd be so proud of you." A knock sounded at the front door. Bella hopped down immediately, Bear dragging behind her. "Is it Grandma or pizza?" We don't get pizza on non-Fridays, but maybe it's a special day." Dan laughed softly. "Hold on. Let Daddy see." He wiped his hands on a towel and crossed the small living room. When he opened the door, sunlight poured in and framed her. Captain Madison Brooks stood on his porch, not in uniform. In jeans, a simple blouse hair, loose and gently curled at the ends. Without her captain's stripes, she looked younger, softer, still strong, but with a kind of warmth that wasn't allowed in cockpits and command rooms. She held a small model airplane in her hands. A-10 Warthog, painted carefully. Loved into existence. Bella gasped. The Sky Lady Madison laughed, kneeling to Bella's height. "Hi, sweetheart," she offered the model gently. "I brought something for you." Bella hugged her bear with one arm, took the plane with the other, eyes wide as constellations. "It's Daddy's plane." Dan blinked, stunned. "You didn't have to," Madison looked up at him. "I wanted to." Bella held the model like treasure. "We should name it, Captain Sparkle." "Hog," Madison grinned. "That's officially the best aircraft name ever." Dan shook his head, but his eyes softened, crinkling in a way they hadn't in years. "Come in, please." Inside the home felt small, but warm, like safety measured in laughter and refrigerator magnets instead of square footage. Madison took in photos on the wall, Bella at the beach, Bella in pigtails, Bella asleep on Dan's chest while he still wore his janitor vest and boots. There were no medals, no certificates, just love. And that weighed more. She spotted a frame turned inward, face hidden. Dan followed her glance, expression pausing for a heartbeat. He flipped it around. A woman smiling, wind in her hair, hand on Dan's chest like she belonged there, like she always would. Madison nodded, understanding deep and immediate. She looks kind. She was everything Dan said, voice quiet, not breaking, but reverent. And she's still here, just in different ways. Bella climbed onto the couch holding her bear, and the new airplane narrating a soft adventure between them. "Bear, do you want to fly? Don't be scared. Daddy taught me skies are big enough to feel safe and brave." Madison watched her with a thawing heart. She feels safe. Dan glanced toward Bella, pride warming him from inside out. She carries the world like it's gentle. I follow her lead. Madison studied him, not the pilot, not the legend whispered in flight halls, but the man. The one who chose floors and buckets over medals and speed. The one who'd rather hold a child than a call sign. "You know," she said softly, "most people spend their lives trying to fly higher. You learned when to land." Dan exhaled slowly. "I spent long enough chasing the sky. Now, I chase mornings like this." Madison nodded. "And you deserve them." A pause, light, cautious, hopeful. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" Dan asked. "It's not fancy, but Bella can teach you the very official Dan and Bella meal blessing song." Bella perked up. "Yes, it goes, wait, I can't tell you, you have to sing it." Madison laughed, eyes shining. "Well, how could I turn that down?" Bella clapped, jumping once like joy couldn't sit still. "Yeah. Tonight we have chicken bites," Dan chuckled. "Chicken nuggets, Bella." "Nah, Daddy. Nuggets are boring. Bites means they bite back." Madison leaned close, whispering conspiratorially to Bella. "I like bites better, too." Bella beamed. A new ally won. Dinner was simple. Laughter wasn't. The meal blessing song involved clapping whispered giggles and a solemn declaration that food tastes yummier when hearts are nice. They ate. They shared small stories. Madison laughed in a way she hadn't since long before the skies tested her. Dan watched Bella dip carrots into ketchup with reckless abandon and felt peace wrap around him like a warm blanket. Outside, evening settled, Fireflies blinked. The world breathed soft. After dinner, Madison stood. I should go before it gets too late. Bella hugged her tightly. Come again, or Daddy will be sad. Dan raised a brow. Will he? Bella nodded, serious. His heart is learning to fly again. Madison met Dan's gaze. Something unspoken passed, gentle, promising, patient. I'll come again, she said quietly. They walked her to the porch. The sky was painted in soft pinks, and gold like forgiveness, and hope had brushed it by hand. Rain-washed air smelled like beginnings. Madison lingered a moment. Dan. Yes, she tucked a hair behind her ear. Not everyone finds a second horizon. You did. He looked toward Bella, who spun slowly in the yard, catching fireflies in invisible jars. She's my horizon, and she's lucky you chose land over sky. Dan turned back to her. Maybe some skies aren't gone. Maybe they just change shape. Madison smiled softly. Maybe. She stepped down the porch, steps, paused, returned halfway, and asked in a voice touched with vulnerability. Dan, do you think someone who spent their life flying could ever learn to land as beautifully as you? Dan held her gaze, eyes tender and steady. I think he said quietly, everyone deserves a soft landing. And sometimes, we learn it together. Madison breathed, heart unfolding like wings, no longer afraid to rest. Good night, Dan. Good night, Madison. She walked into the fading light. Bella tugged his sleeve. Daddy, yes, Peanut. Did we get a new sky friend? Dan lifted her into his arms, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I think we might have. Bella smiled sleepily. Then angels are smiling. Dan looked at the sunset, gentle and full, like life had finally remembered him. Yeah, he whispered. They are. And in a small home with chipped paint and warm hearts, a quiet hero stood not above the clouds, not seeking applause, but holding everything that mattered. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is land, and sometimes love waits right where he touches ground. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Our community stretches across states, countries, and hearts, and every comment feels like a little light along the journey. If this story touched you, even just a little, we warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep sharing gentle, uplifting stories. Stories that honor quiet strength, family, and the everyday heroes among us. Thank you truly for spending your precious time with us. May peace find you tonight, and may kindness follow you wherever you go. Until the next story, stay safe, stay gentle, and stay hopeful.